You're listening to the SBA Loan Experts Podcast, your source for information, tips, and education on the SBA loan program from SBA expert Chris Hearn, founder and CEO of Fountainhead, the nation's leading non-bank SBA lender. Here's your host, Chris Hearn.
So tell me how your organization, your staff, your team handle it. I'm sure some handled it well, some didn't, and you probably have leaders in place. I know the way you function. You probably have equipped some people. How did they handle that? And then the follow-up question, I'll go ahead and give you a glimpse into that, is I want to hear the type people. I know you probably can't give specific on loans and things, but I really am going to start asking about some trends that you saw with businesses and where that goes.
Okay.
But talk about your staff first, how they handled it.
Well, the PPP program officially came online April 3rd, and by April 14th, so not even 2 weeks, the first round was done. It was spoken for. And this was a bit of you may recall, I liken this to a bit of a land grab, right? So you remember, back in the late 1800s going out Wild West, stagecoaches, they from the starting line, they go in Oklahoma and, you put your stake in the ground, or you're out in Nevada or California, you put your stake in the ground and you own that mine or whatever. It was a lot like that, in that you had to get this all important loan number out of the Small Business Administration. And because we're a big champion of their programs in regular times, we know how they operate, and we played by the rules. And the problem is, if you play by the rules when the rules aren't fully laid out, you put yourself at a big disadvantage. And so it took us a little bit to sort of understand that this is different, and this is a very different time, and we had to adjust some things. And in the middle of all this, by the way, the SBA in those first 14 days, they approved more loans than they've done in the last 14 years or something. I mean, it was just insanity. The lending community's never seen anything like this, and probably never will, God willing. But there was tons of media coverage, as you recall, which just stoked more fear and more hysteria. On April 3rd, we had over 4,200 inbound phone calls that day. We don't get 4,200 phone calls, Tim, in 2 years normally, right? I mean, it was insanity. It was so much. We as a good business practice, we would record every incoming phone call, and we say that we're going to do that for training purposes and whatnot. We finally had to turn it off because it was becoming so expensive, all these inbound calls. And ultimately, we ended up hiring contractors for an outsourced call center to help us with this. Our staff was just deluged, just barraged with stuff. To the point, I'd say more than half of my staff broke down at some point in the first month because people were desperate. There was so much desperation on these things. I was on just about every national news outlet I could ever imagine from about mid-March until about mid-April. And then frankly, I went on a media blackout because I had to do the work and I didn't have time. And there's a few times I actually even did. I'd never done this before, Tim. I had press conferences where I had multiple national publications on Zoom, reporters firing away questions. It was this bizarro world. But I shut it down for a good probably 8 weeks or so before I slowly came back to it. And now I'm back to it again, not to that extent, but because we had to do the work. And my people, I'm really impressed, because in times of crisis, I think it really brings out people's true character, and for good and for bad. And fortunately, in my case, mostly I've got great character people. But I had a few people that, they couldn't handle it, and I had to let them go. I mean, they had almost that kind of, I don't want to call it analysis paralysis, but there's that scene in Saving Private Ryan where the young soldier is on the staircase and the Nazi walks back to him and past him, and he had the chance to kill the Nazi who was going to kill somebody. It actually did kill somebody. And I'm probably butchering the scene a little bit, but he's so paralyzed by fear that he doesn't do anything. And the Nazi walks right past him, and later on, I think ends up killing him. I'm not mistaken, or kills his superior or something. And there was a little bit of that. I mean, there's just people deal with adversity in different ways. And it was very challenging as a leader to keep my team focused. I probably didn't communicate as much as I would have liked to, because it was so much coming at me. But at the end of the day, I mean, we did what we could, and it really was, like I said, it felt like wartime leadership in many respects. And it did cool off I would say by late June. By that point, they had already extended the program, and they added another 250 billion or 300 billion or something, and people kind of they took a breath, and there was some of that craziness that came out of it a little bit, and the rest of the program to the very end was pretty comparatively was pretty normal, except for the fact that when you got closer to the deadlines, and the first deadline was June 30th, and they extended that to August 8th. As you got closer to the end of the two deadlines, the insanity of people trying to take advantage of the program, really to take advantage of U.S. taxpayers ultimately, was just off the charts. It got to the point where we were almost like detectives, like, sleuths, like uncovering some of these crazy, forgeries and fraud attempts. And again, we never signed up for this stuff. I mean, we did, but we didn't, not to that extent. And I mean, I bet we've reported probably close to 500 people, because there's a whole process to report them to the Office of the Inspector General at the SBA. I mean, again, first time you hear from an FBI personnel, it's really a little frightening. Even we didn't do anything wrong, of course, but it just, it's that level of respect that you have for them, or concern. But again, by the time you're hearing from FBI folks every other day, it's just old hat. You just kind of roll with it. Yeah.
Your buddies with the FBI. Well, I do want to ask something, because something that I think what you're talking about there is just outright fraud, because on the business side, this is kind of the follow-up question. And I'll share a client story that I've got. Mm-hmm. On the business side, we were asking ourselves questions like, should we, shouldn't we, in general, some of our political beliefs are, we're supposed to do this on our own. We're not supposed to reach out and grab when there's 300, 600, whatever, $100 billion out there. But we had to ask ourselves questions. What does the future look like? And, one client in particular, they did get the loan, and they still have a good bit of that available. And I know for a fact that we would have made some decisions about people to release them if we didn't have that there. And that's kind of what we saw a good bit. But we also, we couldn't project it when we were having to go through the process. I mean, and I'm sure a lot of people are like that. I mean, so what were you hearing from the business people? And I know it's 1,000 different stories, or I don't know what metrics you can share with. It's probably 8 or 9,000, I think, from y'all's standpoint. But what were some trends? What were some things you were hearing on the other side of the phone?
Well, I sympathize with what you're saying, in your view, sort of your honor system, so to speak. Because I mean, I've had a couple times in my life where I was unemployed for a little bit, and I've never filed for unemployment, because I felt like that's for people that are much more desperate situation than me, and I don't want to partake in that. I don't want to possibly take from them, even so much so that I think one time I even tapped my 401k and paid the penalty and everything, which I think is silly that they even have that for those circumstances. But so I understand that. What I would say, and I had this conversation with a number of people, is look, at the end of the day, the federal government's telling you got to close up shop. The federal government's saying you can't take customers. The federal government's telling you have to stay home. You have to shelter in place. Nobody expected this. Nobody wants this. But if it's the choice between your honor and you don't take the money, and then you turn around and you lay people off, and their livelihood suffers, or you do it, I'd like to believe that you should participate in the stabilization of the economy, because that's really what this was about. And so I had that conversation with many people, and I think most folks went ahead and did it. And I think that was the right thing to do. I don't like the fact that it's as large as it is in terms of the dollar amount, but and none of us knew how long this was going to go, as you said. I mean, I can remember back in mid to late March arguing with some of the folks on the small business committee saying, guys, 2.5 times monthly payroll, it's going to 2.5 months. This could be with us a lot longer. Why don't we shoot big? Why don't we go big so we don't have to come back to the well again? Of course, that never seems to work with our form of government, even though it's rational and it makes perfect sense. So I was arguing for 4 times monthly payroll, and unfortunately they have to score these things, and the numbers were already scaring everybody because there's such massive dollar amounts. So ultimately they did 2.5 times. They ran out of money. They ended up doing more, and that's where we get it.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fountainhead, the nation's leading non-bank SBA lender. Fountainhead's team of SBA experts will guide you through every step of the process and get your loan closed faster and more efficient than any bank. Apply today online at FountainheadCC.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the SBA Loan Experts Podcast.